project, you found a project. How do you evaluate the zoning risk on that project?
80% of our projects in Boston require some variances.
Well, thank you very much for having us tonight. This is an honor to be able to speak to everyone and make some new connections and meet some new people, like-minded, but potentially in different fields, but all kind of having the same goal here. My name is Matt Eccles. I'm a zoning attorney. As you can see up there, real estate attorney, father, career movie buff, and avid sports fan. I worked on just randomly a few different projects with people in this room who I wasn't aware would be here tonight, and that's kind of the community we're in. This is a small community, but there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm honored to be here. So I'll let everyone else introduce themselves and then circle back.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. First off, just wanted to recognize and give a quick round of applause again for Whiteacre, Joni Ennis, and this team for bringing this great crew together. So thank you, guys. And now I'll let Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Eric Dackinson. I have an architecture firm. I'm located in Charlestown. Statistics are out there, but we've been doing this work for about 9 years, next month. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of get to know a few of you that we don't know yet and be able to maybe offer some of our battle stories.
Great. These are some of Eric's projects. I'm sure we can refer back to these. My name is Mark Savatsky. I'm a builder. I'm a real estate broker, and I'm a real estate developer. I do owner's rep consulting work. And one thing tonight I want to mention is my brokerage is a really great mastermind group for aspiring real estate developers. They're excellent sales agents. We do leases. We've got a team of about 8 individuals. We get together once a month and we talk real estate development. And I sort of mentor a lot of the guys on my team. So if you're a real estate agent and you aspire to be a real estate developer in some capacity, I would love to chat. But moving on, we have a real estate podcast called The Real Estate Addicts. Award-winning. I have a friend who does public relations. She told me that comes up high on the algorithm, so I use award-winning. I'm not sure what award. But we will not plead the fifth on anything tonight. We're really looking forward to a great conversation, and we're going to answer everything we can honestly and openly, and looking forward to presenting. A couple of my projects here. These are all projects that I've developed personally. The bottom right was a church project that I was on the team for. That's 33 units as of right, and we'll get into what that means. Top right is a new project that I'm developing in Newton. That's 5 townhouses. And we'll come back to any of these if there are questions. Let you, Matt, bring you through the agenda.
I'm also an award-winning attorney. Just don't ask me what I work. Well, I should have mentioned too, so I cut my teeth working in Boston zoning and permitting. Recently, about a year and a half ago, moved to Fletcher Tilton, DC, headquartered out of Worcester, but have the Boston office as well. So my practice is mainly anywhere from Boston to Worcester. I've gone as far as Chicopee. So it's interesting because you see what different municipalities have to offer in terms of incentives to develop, but also every code is that much different than the next. So we'll get into that a little bit further. But I wanted to just go through a couple of precedent images here to kind of lay out the many different forms of the development or an end project, how it can materialize and how it can end up. So I won't bore you with all the details, but on the top left is a project that was approved and is partially built. It's 334 units, about 12 retail spaces over 6 parcels. That include a mixture of ground-up construction, redevelopment of existing sites, in addition to existing infrastructure as well. Over in the middle, that was still is, hasn't been built yet, so it's still a 3-story building that was approved for multifamily residential. At the time, we were going through, well, first we started off with a proposal for short-term rental. As people may or may not know, that became a very hot-button issue, especially in the city of Boston. Absentee landlords doing Airbnbs and things were out of control. So we kind of navigated through that whole process. Originally proposed to do some short-term living there, what was called executive suites. The city of Boston caught on to that trend and very quickly made that conditional use throughout the city. So that halted some of those goals, but we ended up pursuing what's called a compact living pilot program, at this location, which is since now no longer in existence as well. It didn't go quite as well as the city was hoping, but that was the process that took and kind of the pivoting that we did throughout the process and the end result.
I think you're next.
Over on the far right, that was a multifamily residential building that has been built. I don't know if that's the end of my feedback, I apologize. That project went through an appeal. So we got it approved, it got appealed by an abutter. So that's something we'll go through. That's one of the pitfalls of developing anything that needs any kind of zoning relief, that it is subject to an appeal. In some ways it's gotten easier for abutters to do that, in some ways it's gotten harder. So we can talk about that further. Down on the bottom left, not the best picture, but that's a 118 unit residential development that was just approved in the last month in Worcester through the zoning board. We still have the planning board to go through, which again, I can get into great detail. There's sometimes simultaneous processes that you have to work through. And then down the bottom right in the middle right, I just put this in here, really to compare and contrast. So on the bottom right there is actually a project that Mark and I worked on together, recently approved at the Boston Zoning Board for 6 units. It was kind of, I like to think of it as a master class in working with the abutters. Right, the abutters, especially in Boston, but all over, have a say, and they will be heard more than ever. So it took a lot of constant communication with direct abutters, going before community associations, making concessions along the way, whether that's design, which in some ways I think it ended up being a better project than originally designed. So you can get helpful feedback, but you also have to make concessions along the way. And it turned out to be a great project. And then in the middle, I put that because that's an existing building in Alston. A 2-family building, that top story there, it's about half story, had a built-in kitchen, had living space, had been living space forever. The owner purchased it thinking it was a 3-unit, found out 15 years later it was only a 2-family. So we went through the process of converting that to a legal 3rd unit. And that process, with the kitchen already existing, the only work to be done was a second means of egress on a deck on the back. Took about the same time as the image on the bottom right. So sometimes the process is unavoidable, especially when there's mailings and community meetings and statutory regulations for notice and things of the like. So it's something else to keep in mind that the easy ones aren't necessarily always easy. The process regardless. So those are just a few of the projects I just want to highlight, kind of some of the ups and downs and some of the different paths the project can take. I don't know, do you guys want to talk about your images or move on?
No, I'll move on.
No, it's all right. Go to the agenda. All right, so our agenda briefly, I'll just go over this and then we'll get into each topic in more detail. But what is the zoning code? Zoning and permitting attorney, worked with cannabis, liquor licensing, but the zoning code is a moving target and it depends on where you are and at what time for what that looks like to you. We'll talk about what variances versus special permits are, overlays, chapter 91, conditional use permits, and kind of all the different relief you might need along the way when developing. So we'll then get a little further into that and talk about as of right projects versus zoning relief. Good ways to evaluate zoning risk. There's always going to be risk, so how can you best handle that? We have a zoning analysis and study, which Eric will go into in greater detail. The vagaries of zoning relief, not all created equals, and I guess it wouldn't have it any other way. What is covered land play? What is a zoning contingent offer, which I know I was speaking with a few people already about the pros and cons of that. So we'll go into that in greater detail, and then we'll wrap it up with 10 tips. So the zoning code in general, land use regulations that define what is allowed to be built and where it can be built. Everywhere's got some kind of regulations. Boston kind of operates on their own, and then every other municipality has to take a certain track, but with specific differences. And knowing the code and knowing the risk is important going in. I had someone reach out to me the other day, wanted to do 9 units in an R1 district in Chelsea. They sat down, it's a building department, that you can't do that. There's no way we can do that. The zoning board wouldn't be allowed to give you a variance to that. We called in and said, what is this about? These 4 units to Boston where there is given away pretty freely. And looked at the code, Chelsea does not give variances in that district. So you need to know that going in. You might have the land covered, you might think you have setbacks and room for parking, but if you can't get to that end goal of the use, what's the point? So it's important to know the differences and those picks and valleys of each zoning code. It's important just to highlight what I just said because it dictates what you can do by right, what you can do with some relief, and if that relief is even obtainable. So you may know the areas you want to get a 3rd unit in a 2-family district. Is that obtainable or not? And is it likely or not? So that's what we can help you with by knowing the code. As I mentioned briefly, Boston is just its own animal. It's the biggest code you'll ever see. It gets into the minute details that don't make sense half the time. Half the plan examiners, get tripped up by it. So it's a moving target in Boston, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing because they can operate a little bit more freely. Whereas the smaller municipalities may need to have a zoning change through a town meeting, which happens once a year in the spring, and may get voted down depending on who shows up to that town meeting. Boston goes through the zoning commission, so they can adapt and apply. For that executive suite example that I gave to, in a matter of months, they were able to change it from allowed in some districts to conditional because they were reacting to what was going on. We had kind of found a loophole to get around that short-term ordinance. They corrected it, and that can also go the other way. One thing the zoning commission dealt with recently, which we can talk about further, is upping the affordability requirement in the city of Boston, which many people have different opinions on, if that will help the overall affordability crisis or slow down development as a whole because people can't afford to provide housing with the new requirements. I touched on this briefly, but my use is allowed. Am I good to go? No, not necessarily. I would contend that use is certainly the most important because some places you cannot get that use variance, but there are a number of factors you should look at, not just is it a two-family zone or multifamily residential. You need to look at the dimensional regulations. Is there open space requirements, lot coverage, side, front, rear yard setbacks? Parking, what is the parking minimum? There's some places moving away from those minimums, depending on how close you are to public transit. So that's like a key factor, whether you want to offer parking with your project, you may not be able to, or whether you need to provide enough space outside of open space to accommodate the parking requirements. Some areas have specific design requirements, thinking more of downtown Boston, but there are some different ones, throughout different municipalities. And then overlays. The overlays, kind of what it sounds like. It's zoning that gets weighed over the existing zoning, and in some ways offers new or contradicting requirements, and in some places enhances what was already in place. There's a number of things to look at. In Boston, there's the Greenbelt, there's GCOD, which is the Groundwater Conservation Overlay District, which is something that became more widespread a few years back, and really adds another step as a developer. When you want to just do living space in the basement, you might have to now put in a recharge system, which is a whole separate process than a typical zoning process, but does need zoning relief. Parks, if you're closely located to a park, you're going to need parks oversight. And historic properties to demo delay, that's something that's become more and more prevalent as well. Boston specifically has a 90-day demo delay, but they put you through a 3-4 month process to get to that 90 days. Other municipalities, it's a year getting out of the gate, 18 months. So that can significantly hamper you if you have a sense of charity of cost and you think you're getting it around in 6 months, and you find out you can't take down the existing structure for 18 months. So a lot of things go into this besides just is the use allowed. The variance itself. So variance is a request to deviate from the zoning code, bylaw, or ordinance. It has the highest standard to be given by a zoning board. In Boston, again, it's not necessarily need to be proven all the time. Other municipalities, it certainly does. You need to show there's a hardship, there's a topography of a lot. The common example is a triangle lot. How can you have side setbacks, rear setbacks, and the like if you have a very odd-shaped lot? If you have a regular rectangle lot and you want to put 6 units on a 2-family zone, that's not a hardship. A lot of towns will not give you a variance to that. Special permit or conditional use, as they call it in Boston, requires relief, but it's a lower threshold. It's normally much more detrimental to the community or not a break in character. In terms of the overall process, to go through this quickly, in Boston, you would typically file with sexual services. Typically, you would know you need zoning relief, so you file a nominal fee letter just to get in the door. They're issued a refusal letter anywhere from 30 to 60 days later. Once you have that refusal letter, you have to go through a community process. This is fairly unique to Boston, where you work with a coordinator from each local district and have an abutter meeting. You have to flyer in 300 feet in all directions and basically host a meeting to tell everyone what you're planning to do. I've had many no-shows, and I've had many angry abutters out the door complaining about projects. From there, you might have to go through a local civic association. The city of Boston specifically is littered with those. South Boston's got 9 or 10 alone, Roxbury, Dorchester. They all have their own jurisdiction, their own pockets, and you go and present in front of them. And so it's a very community-based process to even get to the zoning board. Once you've completed a community process, you would then go before a zoning board, or City of Boston zoning board in this example, hopefully get your relief, and then the real fun starts. design review with the BPDA, final construction documents, getting everything back to ISC, and dealing with getting a building permit. So that's the process in a nutshell. I used to say 6 to 9 months, even for smaller projects like that 2 to a 3 family. That number, can raise or shorten depending on which jurisdiction and how much community process you have. But every community meeting you have is going to set you back a month. It just takes time to get on their agenda. Some of these community groups meet once a month. Sometimes they skip December, and all of a sudden you've lost 2 or 3 months just waiting to go back and show your updates. Outside of Boston, it's more typical to start your community process at the hearing. You file your plans, you either get a rejection or you request a variance or a special permit up front, and then maybe no one shows to the hearing and you get it that night, or maybe it's continued 2, 3, 4 times as well because now people are worrying about it the first time. So that's kind of the difference in process between Boston and outside of Boston. A couple other topics just to touch upon very briefly. The appeal period. So as I mentioned, that project that got appealed. Abutters do have a right to appeal. You can get whatever you want approved by a local zoning board. If someone doesn't want it bad enough, they can file an appeal in either land court or superior court and tie you up for 6 months, for 1 year, for 2 years. Maybe it's a money grab, who knows? Maybe they really don't want it because they've lived there for 100 years. There's a number of reasons. And that's where those standards can really come into play too. Even if you've been given relief by the City of Boston Zoning Board for 20 units in a 2-family zone, you get appealed, it's going to be hard to prove it in Superior Court that you actually met your burden there. The good thing is there's been a couple cases lately where you really have to prove as the abutter you have standing, meaning you have a right to appeal this because you're affected enough, and that there's an actual harm. So just coming out and saying there might be a few more cars in the street, parking might get a little bit tougher, or there's going to be a shadow at one time during the day is not enough to prove an actual harm. So to prove it gets a little bit harder, but once you're appealed, that's going to throw a wrench in your plans, whether it's time, money, or just losing the project altogether. The final thing I'll say right now, and then I'll pass it along, is the burden is always on the applicant. And that's part of why you want a good team. I've had projects where I've come into it after the fact and someone's already been building for 6 months and there's a complaint or ISD gets involved and you realize they never got the side yard setback they needed. Well, now you're going through that process. You don't get a get out of jail free card because ISD missed it and the zoning board gave you some relief, but not all the relief you needed. You need to go back and start that process again. File an amendment to your plans, get a refusal letter, start a community process again, and go through that whole thing. That could cost you 9 months by missing one variance that you needed that wasn't granted to you through no fault of your own, other than not knowing that you needed it and no one else catching it. So it's always important to check and double check that the relief you're getting covers you completely and is obtainable. I think with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you. I wanted to kind of elaborate in particular on these are 2 Boston projects that clearly that where one of them had 0 variances and the other didn't, and the other required variances. And I'm going to kind of get into the timeline that was required in order to get these 2 projects under construction. But for those of you who have not kind of done a zoning project before, one of the things that you'll constantly be asked to kind of to show and explain to the neighbors, explain to the community, is what zoning variances are required. The architect or the civil engineer or the attorney will create a table like the one you see here. And these are the 2 projects I'm going to kind of walk through fairly quickly here. But you notice the one on the left, under comments, there's nothing there. Every part of that project complied with the zoning code. The one on the right, you look under the comments, you see that there are a number of variances required, and even where there are no variances required, it was actually some things that we had to prove, reasons we didn't need that particular variance. I would say that 80% of our projects in Boston require some variances. Sometimes it's 1, very often it's 3 or 4. Once in a while we get one that's kind of a Christmas tree like this with a lot of things on it. These are the 2 projects. They look fairly similar. They're both 3 units. They both have they both have 3 parking spaces, or actually I think the one on the right just has 2 parking spaces. They look like they're 4 stories. There are different reasons that the one on the left is from a zoning standpoint only 3 stories, but same size project. So I wanted to kind of set that tone. They happen to be in Mission Hill in East Boston, but that's somewhat irrelevant. It had a lot of this had to do with the size of the lot. A lot of it had to do with the size of the kind of ask. And the zoning for those two neighborhoods is very different, even though both of them roughly allow this project. So the one on the top here, this is a hypothetical. This is not what actually happened, but I'll walk you through what actually happened. Generally speaking, at the beginning of the project, we start the design. We file something, this is in Boston, we file something with ISD. Now, the project is kickstarted in different ways in different places, but in Boston, you start the project with the city by filing with ISD, and then you get refused. As people talk about the refusal set. The set is really a zoning review set. All of that, just filing with the ISD and getting the refusal takes 30 days. So you want to get the clock started right away because that 30 days is just the first step. Then community review process. We were saying you have neighborhood, you have abutters. Very often the abutters meeting can get scheduled very quickly, but the neighborhood meeting might not be next month. It might be the month after that you get on the agenda. They want you to come back a second time. They decide not to vote on it the second time. Before you know it, 4 months pass. A lot of sitting and waiting, not a lot of activity, not a lot to do. During this process, we might be revising the drawings. We might be making some changes to the design. Might be just having conversations with the neighbors, a lot of conversations with the neighbors to help them get comfortable with the idea that you're going to change the fabric of their neighborhood. If you're lucky, 3-4 months in, the Office of Neighborhood Services says, go before the zoning board, but realistically, you can't get a date for 6 weeks. Maybe it's 8 weeks. All of a sudden, you're at month 9, month 10, or you have your zoning hearing. Then there's the appeal period, as you said. It's an opportunity for your neighbors who maybe didn't feel their objection was appropriate. All of a sudden, they could appeal. A lot of times, it's just a waiting game. You wait, and then you get the BPDA design review in Boston. Almost every project that we've ever done with a zoning hearing has had a design review. Maybe 10% of them, for some reason, they decide nobody cares what it looks like. But anyway, so that could take, depending on the reviewer you get, depending on how willing you are to give in to the demands of the BPDA design review, that could be a month. That sometimes takes 2 months to get your first response back. So I put it down here as 4 months, which we see as kind of our average, but it can take longer than that. After that, or while that's going on, usually I recommend that we hold off on getting all the engineers and all the other drawings done until we're getting our first feelings back from the BPDAs. Because on my first project, the BPDA changed a ton of things and all the engineers had to redo their drawings. So I always say wait for the first kind of pass of comments, but a lot of times people will actually try and start some of the engineering drawings earlier because it takes some time. You get your BPDA design set back, and you want to be able to dump everything into ISD at that moment, all of your contractor information, everything you could possibly imagine that they're going to want to review. And you notice we're a year into the process already. Maybe ISD turns it back on the first pass, but typically they'll have a couple of clarification questions, and it'll take them a month to formulate the questions and a month to review the questions. So let's say that process was 17 months to get the building permit, and then you got to build the thing. If we were to do a no variance process, you submit everything, and you want to submit everything that's here, up at the beginning. So it may take a lot longer to get to that first filing, but you could have the building permit in a couple of months. So I put down 8 months. We've seen it faster, but it's definitely a different process if you're not going after the zoning variances. I did a study. I went back and I checked those 2 projects that I showed you earlier, and you can see kind of that the first part did take a little bit longer, but the other pieces in here generally took about the same the amount of time that I had just shown you on the hypothetical. That project is under construction right now. It's framed, but we started it in October of 2020, the East Boston one. This one here, case study number 2, we started it in November of 2021. They sold the last units a couple of weeks ago. So 3 years, including the construction. to get there. So it's just if variances are required, it's going to take a long time to recognize that value, and you have to buckle in and just kind of be patient. There are things you can do to try and hurry some of this along. Maybe we have a few tips, but generally speaking, you have to understand that it's going to be a much longer process. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark for a little bit.
Thanks, Eric. So you have a project, you found a project. How do you evaluate the zoning risk on that project? Eric alluded to it a little bit earlier, but one, we have zoning attorneys, two, architects, three, read the code yourself. It's not enough to look at that dimensional table and understand that you've made the requisite setbacks, the use, et cetera. There are tripwires and they're buried everywhere. So for example, a friend of mine was doing a project in Jamaica Plain. He bought it on a non-contingent basis for a large dollar value, and he intended to do a series of townhouses. There is a provision within the code which dictates your minimum front yard width, which you'd think applies for the whole building. There is something in Boston, they call it the Susan Rice rule. It's not codified anywhere. Susan Rice was a previous ISD assistant commissioner 10 years ago, but they have taken the position that the minimum lot width applied to each townhouse and not to the parcel of land. So he's way over his ski tips here and backpedaling, trying to recover. It's just one example. Another one is, insufficient maneuverability, right? This idea that you need to be able to make a 3-point turn and exit a driveway face forward so as to not trip insufficient maneuverability as a zoning citation. So I know I sound like the boogeyman here, but there's just permit means permission. And in Boston, I'm sorry to say it, but you're not entitled to anything, despite calling it entitlement, right? That's the running joke. If your neighbors are vocal, if they carry some political capital, you may find that some provision of the zoning code is interpreted in a certain way that sends you to the Zoning Board of Appeals for a variance. So that's all to say, be very careful. You want to engage the right professional to speak with, to provide you a zoning summary, a zoning analysis, often your lender. Next aspect to this, right, you've identified a property that you think is a good target for zoning, a zoning play. Well, what does it look like? What can you fit on that lot? How many units? So this is actually that Newton project I mentioned earlier on. This is about a $2,000 study. I worked with my architects, and it's very basic, right? They look like cartoons, but what they're giving me is some critical information. I know my lot coverage. I know how many parking spaces I have. So many zoning projects come down to parking, right? So I know how many units, my parking ratio, my floor area ratio, and I'm gonna stop here and just hit on something which may be obvious, but deserves to be said, which is that it's all about square footage, not unit count, right? Every square foot that I build is $240 a square foot. Maybe it's $300 a square foot, but every square foot that I sell is $500 plus a square foot. So whether I have 2 triple deckers or 4 consecutive 2,200 square foot townhouses, if they're the same square footage, generally speaking and within reason, and we can talk about where this makes sense, because obviously there are limits to this logic. You can't build 6,000 square feet and expect in Dorchester and expect to get the same 600 a square foot, but I'm very interested in knowing my efficiency. So these zoning studies, we call them block plans, fit plans. These are going to give you your yield. So what is your gross square footage relative to your net square footage? How efficient is your building? How many square feet are you losing to your lobby, to your corridor? You're spending money on those and you're not getting money on the back end. So these are gonna give me my GSF, my gross square foot, my net square foot, the height of the building, and I'm gonna run an Excel spreadsheet with 6 tabs across the bottom, and I'm gonna study every different scenario, and I'm gonna make a sensitivity analysis here that says, all right, if it's 3 townhouses, I skate by the skin of my teeth. If it's 6 townhouses, I just took the skin off the ball. It's a grand slam. I land at 5 townhouses. You can't always predict, but you need to understand how that's gonna go. This is another example. This is about a $5,000 fit plan, a zoning study, something we looked at in the south end. And again, it's just a little bit more detail to it. And I'm going to turn this back to Eric and come back on later and talk a little bit about how to manage that risk that we just described, how to avoid those tripwires and protect yourself. So here's Eric.
So I want to share another couple of examples of projects that we've been involved in. I want to throw this up there so that you would understand kind of some of the things we're talking about. Most of you would understand kind of this project clearly or most likely has a side yard setback. This project extends quite far into the rear yard. This is the front of the building. You can see that it covers a lot of the property. It's in East Boston, so we went through a zoning variance process. So this was started in November of 2018. No parking, 4 units, 4 stories, pretty straightforward. Small number of variances here. We got it approved. It was under construction when someone came to us with they had purchased the property next door and said, I love what happened there. I would like to do the same thing. Now, you would assume, you look on the right side here, pretty much exactly the same thing. Same lot next door. Started in April 21, 4 units, no parking, roof deck, same footprint, almost the same design. I'm not going to lie, he asked us to make it look very much like the one that the neighbors had appreciated. We'd gone through BPDA design review, so we knew what they felt the neighborhood wanted to be. And so we were not reinventing the wheel. We did make some small improvements, but we felt like this was tried and true. So this one was approved, and the one next door, literally the head of the zoning board said to us, I know this was the right project for this street 3 years ago. There's been a lot of construction on this street since then. We feel like it's too dense now. There was nothing to do. The project was over. Client luckily had it on a contingency and was able to kind of walk away from it. But it was exactly the same project, exactly the same neighborhood. 3 years later, there had been a lot of construction, on that street. And so sometimes there isn't a lot you can do. There is no such thing as precedent. And
Unless it benefits you. If precedent benefits you, then argue precedent. But otherwise, precedent does not.
Absolutely. 2 more projects that we saw rejected, but they kind of came at us out of the blue. Like the one on the left here, 2,000 square foot lot, empty, no neighbors, actually kind of overgrown. Matt and I worked on it together for a while. Overgrown, the street, very densely packed street, but this one lot was completely empty. And a client came to us, a developer, but a person who said, this lot is perfect for me and my family. It's in the center of where I'm doing a bunch of my projects. I'm going to build a single family home for myself on a 2,000 square foot lot in the 3F zone. 3F 5,000 zone. Everything around me is 3 family. Some of them are 6 family. Some of them are 3 and 3.5 stories. As you can see, we were rejected. We made a bunch of changes to the project. We talked to the neighbors. I think we were on it for 2.5 years of going back and forth with the neighbors. Got to the zoning board. The same people had never relented, and the lot is empty to this day. At the same time, the other project here, 3 family in a 3F zone. The lot was a little small for what we wanted to do, but we proposed 3 family with 2 parking spaces. We went through, we got very few comments from the neighbors. We made almost no changes before we went to the zoning board. We actually took it upon ourselves to make a few changes to make it prettier because we were getting ready to go before the board. And again, rejected for reasons we couldn't exactly understand. But we had, in one case, made all the changes you could think of. We had added parking, we'd removed parking. We had taken off a level, we had taken out the basement. We had reduced the size to the point where the developer said, I don't want to live here anymore. It used to be my 2,400 square foot dream home. Now it's 1,600 square feet and it's compromised in every possible way. I don't want to live here anymore, and well, it was rejected, so nobody's going to live there. But then on the other hand, neighbors came to meetings, didn't tell us, didn't object. We were in an empty lot, a similarly empty lot, and at the zoning board, they looked at it and they said, it's too dense. We had no idea that the BPDA or the ZBA was going to do that. So sometimes you can't do anything about it. The other thing I want to talk about with vagaries is a lot of these rejected projects something gets built later on. But you have to understand that there are trade-offs. That for about half of the projects that I've worked on, something was eventually approved, but you start over at in Boston, you start over at square one. You may actually be a little bit back from where you were because of your reputation with the neighbors. You may come back, you may have, in a couple of these cases, proposed a 4-family, they decided it was too dense, you come back with a 3-family, and the neighbors are just as angry or just as upset as before. Now you may have the BPDA in a lot of cases recognize the fact that this was kind of a major concession and a year had passed and people were a little less upset, or other political things might have happened. A few of these were rejected by one zoning board and approved by another. But you have to recognize it's not the end of the world, but it is starting over from scratch, and you do end up having holding costs and reputational damage with everybody, from your investors to the neighbors to the people that you have to pay to go through this process again. I think that's, you again.
Yeah. So I guess the idea here is that, look, you can go buy a stable back bay rental property that's got everything there. There's no margin in that. You might as well put your money in a 5% government bond right now. So we look for risk as real estate developers. That's where we make our margin. But just like sort of one of my favorite sayings here, no astronaut launches through space with their fingers crossed, right? So we identify the risk and we devise a plan for it, whether that's asbestos or zoning. Here, we're here to talk about zoning risk. So heads I win, tails I don't lose much. That's the best kind of bet there is. So I'm always gonna look at the worst case scenario and underwrite against that. This is an actual project that I completed this past year in Dorchester. This was a single family on the MLS. It was $699,000. It was a decent single family. I really saw some potential in it. The lot was 80 feet wide. I love a lot that's got a lot of frontage. Lot depth is cool, but diminishing returns on depth. This lot happened to be like 90 feet wide. I saw it as 4 townhouses. I thought if I don't get 4 townhouses, I can renovate this 1975 single family and get out of it alive. So this was an example where the seller would not entertain a zoning contingent offer. So I made a full price offer at this, and I ended up getting 4 townhouses approved on this lot. But all the other projects, almost every project I've done really going back, zoning contingent offer, zoning contingent, non-contingent, top right is zoning contingent. And again, this 33-unit church was as of right, which was our competitive advantage. We really understood the zoning and we knew exactly what we could do, so we outbid everyone. And I'm fine if somebody outbids me on a project, if they see it in a more creative fashion, if they knew more about the property, they had an informational advantage. I really do hate it when people outbid me on something because they planned on getting 13 variances and they're just crossing their fingers. And so if we could collude on one thing tonight, I'd hope that we all approach things with zoning variances, zoning contingent offers. And this is an example of what a zoning contingent offer might look like. In my experience, you have to be very solid to make a zoning contingent offer. Your seller's not gonna go along for the ride just to let you take their car out for a joyride. They gotta know that you're serious, that you've experienced. If you have a financing contingency, no seller is gonna give you the keys for 12 months to see if you can or cannot get the zoning, but then can't get financing. So your offer needs to be squeaky clean. You need to have a great resume. I strongly recommend putting in a letter to the seller, showing your financials, showing your resume, and put some skin in the game. you will very quickly, and what I will tell sellers often with a straight face is, I'm going to spend $30,000 to $40,000 in the next 90 to 120 days. I'm invested in this deal. Give me 6 months, give me 7 months, and I will understand which direction the wind is blowing. At that point, I'll start making non-refundable deposits towards the purchase price of this property. And maybe those payments escalate up and up as time goes on. But you have to be willing to go to bat, right? Like, leave the room if you're not willing to spend that money on a zoning, on the play, just to stand there. This is what separates, I don't say this demeaningly, but, house flipping is great and there's margins in it, but being a real estate developer, to me, this is where the margin is. This is where the art comes in. So I think I talked briefly about some of these, and I'm just going to talk about forms of a zoning contingent offer. You can make this as complicated as you want. You can make the purchase price tied to the number of units, the gross square foot. I've seen sellers who want a condominium back at the end of the project. We've made that deal. I prefer to keep things simple. I find that I'm the real estate developer. The seller is not. They don't have any experience with this. Try to make things as easy to understand and digestible as possible if you want to achieve success. And so with this, we'll flow into a couple personal tips and we'll open it up to.
So we had a handful of tips, so hopefully these will kind of spur more conversation. But one that personally I find to be very helpful when you're meeting with neighbors, when you're meeting with the abutters, when you're in a neighborhood presentation, even when you're presenting to the ZBA, keep in mind that you're the one making money out of this project. A lot of those other people, most of them are volunteers. They're there because they love their community. They are there because of other motivations. And keep that in mind, that while there may be some knock-on benefits to them, and there may be some very real benefits to them, you're going to be the one making the most out of this situation. So, be respectful, be honest, be clear with it, and be honest with yourself in the situation, and don't think about it as they're being entirely unreasonable because they've got different motivations than you're going to have in all these conversations. The second one was actually the first thing that I thought of whenever I talk to people. You're going to buy a property. You're going to get there. You're going to ask the people in the neighborhood to trust you. Clean it up. Be there. Be a neighbor. Be friendly. I can't tell you how many times, at least a dozen, we've been in a meeting where a neighbor says, "How can I trust you? The house has looked like crap since the day you took it over." Be a member of the community and understand that at the end, you're not going to be the one in the community, but for the time being, you're one of them. You're one of the people who's most interested in that because you want them to take care of their properties. It helps you sell your properties or rent your properties, so get that. I find far too often people aren't real understanding or appreciative of the time value of their money. We might get halfway through this process, and the one thing that is most important to the neighbors might be a shadow study. It might be a landscape architect. It could be just a couple of drawings that help them understand how this is going to impact the character of their neighborhood. And the client says to me, "Well, I don't want to spend that $750, $2,000. I don't get much value out of it." And we go through 3 more neighborhood meetings. We find people who are just opposed to us because we didn't want to spend just a little bit of extra that was going to maybe make people feel like cleaning the neighborhood, like we are invested in making sure that this is a project that does have some benefits for other people. So I can't stress it enough. I know that it's money, and I know that it's time, and it sometimes increases the complexity. But I think that some of these things can be very, very helpful.
I know we're running a little bit long, so I'll try to be brief here with the next 3. But first, don't fall in love with your initial proposal. Be ready to compromise. We have to realize that this, especially, and I keep going back to Boston, I think we're mostly talking about Boston, but it's all over. A project, that one of the ones I showed from Worcester there, we had a community meeting when it wasn't required to let people know what we were thinking, to gain feedback, and then we went in front of the boards. We were able to tell them We've had these conversations. We've made changes based upon the feedback we heard. You're certainly going to get that in Boston. There's a community process for a reason. You know, one every 15, 20 projects, it's such a small ask. Maybe no one comes to that meeting. Maybe no one cares. That's not going to happen a lot. People are savvier as neighbors. They know about the appeal process. They know what floor area ratio means. 5 years ago, maybe they didn't. They know the questions to ask. They know where to fight you. They know what the issues are. They live there, right? If parking's an issue and you're saying it'll be fine, you don't need parking for this 3-4 units we want to put up, you have to fight that fight with them. So your project is going to change. Now you can build in some of that change and be ready to pivot on a dime to, you know, not have to reinvent the whole wheel, but it's going to change. And that project I showed earlier on the bottom right, I think it actually turned into a much better project. The design fits the neighborhood better, and that came from direct feedback from abutters. So be ready to compromise. Going along right with that, over-communicate, whether that's informal presentations, updates on construction once you're through the process, promising to provide those updates. A lot of the concern comes through, are you going to shut down my street for a week or two and I'm not going to be able to get, you know, to my home or to my driveway? So be upfront with them, collect an email list if needed. If and when you're approved, follow through on those promises because your reputation is the only thing you have. I personally, you know, as a zoning attorney and as a rep for a developer, I'll go to as many meetings as needed. I'll flyer the neighborhood for you. I will be involved, but I'm not probably door knocking and trying to sell the project one-on-one to abutters. That's something that you'll have to do as the developer. Going back to number one, you know, certainly this is my job, but you're the one with the most skin in the game. You're the one who's got to foster these relationships, eventually build something and be a neighbor while you're building and potentially after, depending on what the outcome of that project is. So over communicate. You know, there's something to be said about waking the dead and kind of inviting too much opinion before you get started. But once you do get started, you're in the thick of it. So you better be ready to communicate, keep people updated, and again, to go back to 4, eventually compromise. And finally, number 6, don't put the cart before the horse. This can come in a number of different ways, whether it's assuming you have a certain number of units or a certain floor area ratio, or you get in there and you buy a property and the first thing you do is cut down a bunch of trees. And then when we go out for our first meeting, the whole neighborhood's up in arms and say, how dare you? That was a 150-year-old tree that provided us shade. We hate you no matter what you propose here. So be careful. That goes back to what Eric was mentioning about taking care of the property. Don't take care of it so much that you destroy what it was before you get a little bit of feedback. So you need to just take it slow, make sure you hit the right steps. Cleaning up the property is great, but destroying what people know it as is not, and it'll put you in a bad position, and you're not going to have a lot of friends going through that process. And some of this, especially in Boston, is who you're next to. Your abutters, whether they know someone, whether they have connections, or whether they're just loud, can be the biggest thorn in your side. Your ZBA needs you to give the approvals, but they like to give approvals when it's a less contentious process and project. So,
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, take notes, right? You're in front of the crowd. Somebody offers a comment, something that you don't like, they're critical of. This is not the time to try to win an argument. I think this advice here is worth the price of admission. You ready? I'd like to discuss this further. Can I buy you a cup of coffee later this week? It's diffused, it's over. Now follow up with them and buy a cup of coffee and talk about it. You might not win them to your side, but they might not hate you, and that's actually worth a lot. Get involved in your neighborhood. So this really was a big thing in my career early on. I served on the Jeffreys Point Neighborhood Association. I went to every meeting every Thursday night. I learned a lot. It helped me as a real estate developer. Always answer honestly, kind of goes back to don't put the cart before the horse. One first neighborhood meeting, someone said, do you own the property? And I didn't feel like explaining what a zoning contingent offer was, so I just said yes. She held up basically a title report she did on the property, called me a liar, and I lost credibility, and it was a downhill slide from there. And no one cares as much as you do. Again, kitchen table diplomacy. Just, you know, everyone only has so much political capital, so many calls they can make. It's your baby, you need to care the most, and you will be endlessly frustrated if you think other team members are going to care as much as you do and expect them to do the work. So thank you guys, it's been great. We'd love to entertain questions if we have time, Ennis, I don't know. And then thank you. Thank you guys.
Mentioned about employers potentially having problems with design, but then there's also the as of right project. So how do those two
Yeah, so the question is, if abutters have problems with the design, there are also as-of-right projects. That is generally the beauty of an as-of-right project. Should you find that diamond, there is no design review. Historically, there's no affordability requirement on an as-of-right project. And you can make it purple, pink, or yellow. So that is one of the benefits, certainly.
But also to keep in mind, though, especially in Boston, as mentioned, I think Eric mentioned this earlier, Mark said, it's a dime a dozen is too frequent, right? The code is antiquated. There's not a lot you can do. The lot's either undersized or there's going to be one of those trip wires we mentioned. So great if you can find it. It definitely limits your exposure. And a butter still could file an appeal after a permit's been issued, saying there should have been a side yard setback and drag you through either back to the zoning code, or, excuse me, the zoning board of appeal, to then bring an ISD and have a back and forth about was there a mistake. Typically there's not, but mistakes happen, but that they still can slow you down that way. It's not nearly as significant as an appeal to something with zoning relief, though.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for this. I want to go a little bit further on the erase the risk. I like that. But how do you think of the, I guess, the zoning risk or the cost of the zoning compliance as overall percent of the cost of the project? And then kind of follow on that, with the timeline so long, what kind of a pipeline do you usually think about having so that you're constantly moving, but you have 8, 12, 18-month timelines?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the beauties of a zoning contingent offer is that you don't own it until you get your permits, and ideally, the appeal period has expired. So if we look at this project, top right corner, I don't own that yet. I closed on that on April 15th, and I've been under agreement for 9 months doing all the work. So that's one of the things. But look, there was no backup plan there. I have 5 townhouses. If someone told me at the very beginning I could get 4 townhouses of right, I would have to think very hard about going through that whole process to gain that marginal benefit.